The sun was just rising over the dusty hills of Arkansas when a baby named James Brown Miller came into the world on October 25, 1861. No one could have known that this quiet child, born into a simple farming family, would one day become one of the most feared men in the American West. In those days, life was tough. The Civil War was tearing the country apart, and families struggled to survive. Little Jim's family was poor but honest. His parents taught him to pray before meals, to tell the truth, and to never harm another soul. But fate had other plans. When Jim was still a boy, death came to visit his family. His father was killed, and soon after, his mother passed away too. Some said it was sickness. Others whispered it was something darker. Whatever the cause, Jim and his brother and sister were left alone, lost and broken. They were sent to live with their grandparents in Texas, a wild land where life was cheap and tempers were short. And there, something terrible happened that would mark the rest of Jim's life. One hot afternoon, neighbors heard a loud gunshot from the Miller home. When they ran inside, they found Jim's grandfather lying on the floor, dead. The story spread like wildfire. Some said the old man had been cruel to Jim. Others believed the boy didn't know what he was doing. But one thing was clear. The shot had come from Jim's hands. He was only 8 years old. From that day, people looked at him differently. His eyes seemed colder, his smile emptier. He rarely spoke about what happened, and when he did, he claimed it was an accident. But deep inside, something dark had woken up, a strange calmness around death, a comfort in violence. Years passed, and Jim grew into a tall, clean-cut young man. He always wore neat clothes and a polite smile. He went to church every Sunday, read his Bible, and refused to drink or swear. People called him Deacon Jim because he looked more like a preacher than a cowboy. But behind that quiet face was a storm. By the time he was in his 20s, Miller had started working as a lawman in Pecos, Texas. At first, folks thought he was the perfect choice. Honest, well-dressed, respectful. But soon strange things began to happen. Enemies of Miller's friends ended up dead. Rivals disappeared in the night. And each time there was one man who seemed to be nearby. Deacon Jim. He was clever. He didn't pick fights. He waited. He watched. And when the moment came, he used his shotgun, a double-barreled weapon that he kept hidden under his coat. He liked to strike from the shadows, not face to face. That's how he worked. Quick, silent, deadly. Some said he killed only for money. Others said he killed for pleasure. Maybe both were true. Rumors grew that Miller would take any job for the right price. Cattle barons, outlaws, even politicians paid him to solve their problems. He charged anywhere from $150 to $2,000, depending on who the target was. And when the money was right, Deacon Jim went to work. Always calm, always in his white frock coat, always leaving no witnesses. People in Texas began to whisper his name with fear. If you crossed a powerful man, you didn't just worry about revenge. You worried about Miller. To the world, he was polite and God-fearing. To his victims, he was a ghost in the dark, and yet no one could ever prove anything. He always had an alibi. He always smiled when questioned. The law couldn't touch him, and the people didn't dare try. But inside that cold smile was something haunting. Jim Miller believed he was doing God's work. In his twisted mind, he thought that killing bad men was a kind of justice. His justice. He'd pray before a murder and thank the Lord afterward. To him, it wasn't murder. It was destiny. As the years rolled on, his name spread from Texas to Oklahoma, from ranch towns to law offices. If Deacon Jim's after you, people whispered, you'd better start praying. No one knew exactly how many people he killed. Some said a dozen, some said 40, but one thing was certain. He never stopped. He lived a double life. The righteous preacher on Sunday, the paid assassin on Monday. And as his legend grew, so did his confidence. By the dawn of the 1900s, Jim Miller was untouchable. He had friends in every town, money in his pockets and death in his hands. He was a man who smiled at funerals and tipped his hat at the gallows, and yet, behind that calm face, even he knew, one day, the darkness would come for him too, because no matter how clean his white coat looked, no matter how sweet his prayer sounded, the devil was already waiting. This was the beginning of the legend, the rise of Jim Killer Miller, the man who killed for God, for gold, and for glory, The town of Pecos, Texas was dry, dusty, and mean, the kind of place where a man's shadow carried more secrets than his smile. It was here that Jim Miller made a name for himself, not as an outlaw, not yet, but as a lawman. He walked with a preacher's calm, wore a clean white shirt, and always tipped his hat to the ladies, to the townsfolk. He looked like a man you could trust, quiet, polite, and devoted to God. They called him Deacon Jim. But they didn't know that the man who prayed on Sunday was planning his next kill by Monday. In 1888, Miller became a deputy sheriff in Pecos. He spoke softly, never raised his voice, and quoted the Bible to anyone who'd listen. But under that calm surface, he had a cold fire burning inside him, the same darkness that had followed him since childhood. He told people that he believed in law and order. And he did. But in his mind, he was the law, and his gun was order. Not long after he took the badge, one of his fellow lawmen, a man named Bud Fraser, began to notice things weren't right. Criminals that Miller arrested didn't always make it to trial. Some just disappeared. Miller would shrug and say, "They tried to escape." The people believed him, at first, but Fraser didn't. He'd seen Miller's cold stare. He'd seen how his hand rested too easily on that hidden shotgun, and one day the truth finally exploded, literally. In 1894, Miller and Fraser got into a bitter argument. The air in Pecos was hot and heavy, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Fraser had had enough. He accused Miller of being a murderer in a badge. He said Miller was using the law as a cover for his crimes. Miller smiled, the same smile that had fooled everyone for years. Then a week later, Fraser was ambushed. He was shot dead, blown apart by a shotgun blast. No one saw who pulled the trigger, but everyone knew who it was. Jim Deacon Miller. Yet again, the law couldn't touch him. He had friends, connections, and an army of people willing to swear he'd been somewhere else. And so, he walked free. From then on, Miller learned something important. Fear is more powerful than bullets. He dressed better, prayed louder, and smiled wider. He went to church every Sunday, sitting near the front pew with his Bible open. He even taught Sunday school sometimes, preaching about sin and forgiveness. People began to see him as a holy man, a God-fearing soul, trying to bring peace to violent lands. But at night, the deacon disappeared, and when Killer Miller came alive, he started taking paid jobs. Contracts, they were called. Cattlemen, bankers, politicians, they all had enemies, and Miller was happy to remove them for the right price. His methods were always the same. No duel, no warning, no mercy. He'd hide in the shadows, wait for the right moment, and fire his shotgun into his target's chest. One blast, one kill, clean, fast, and quiet. Then, he'd disappear into the night. And the next morning, he'd be seen walking to church, Bible in hand, as if nothing had happened. By the late 1890s, Miller's name was spreading across the West. In Texas, people whispered, "If Deacon Jim is after you, start praying." Even hardened outlaws avoided his path. He was the kind of man who'd shake your hand with a smile while planning your funeral. He had money now, more than most ranchers made in a lifetime. But he still lived simply, still wore that same white frock coat, still kept his Bible close. He said it reminded him of what was right, though no one knew what right meant to Jim Miller anymore. In 1891, Miller married Sally Clements, a respectable woman from a good family, and the cousin of Outlaw, John Wesley Hardin, one of the most famous gunfighters in the West. To Sally, Miller was a good husband, quiet, polite, and religious. He bought her gifts, prayed with her, and never raised his hand against her. But even Sally didn't truly know him. She didn't see the blood on his hands, the fear behind his name, or the way his eyes changed when someone mentioned revenge. She thought she'd married a man of faith. She had no idea she was sleeping beside a professional killer. Miller believed he was chosen, not by man, but by God. He told himself that every killing was a service, a necessary act to keep the wicked in line. In his mind, he wasn't doing wrong. He was simply delivering justice. But deep down, somewhere beneath the calm words and polite manners, there was a whisper, a dark voice that said, "You're not God's man, you're mine." And slowly that voice became his truth. Each kill made him bolder. Each prayer made him feel cleaner. He became a legend, a ghost in white, a man who could kill anyone and walk away untouched. People feared him. The law failed to stop him, and the church protected him. But like all devils dressed as saints, his time was coming. For now, the towns still bowed to him, the rich still paid him, and the desperate still called for him. But somewhere out there, vengeance was waiting, and when it arrived, it would tear down the mask of the preacher and reveal the monster underneath. The wind was sharp over the Texas plains, and the towns were restless. News of a man dressed in white, riding through the night with a shotgun under his coat, spread like smoke through the saloons and churches. People whispered his name with fear, Deacon Jim Miller. He didn't look like a killer. His clothes were always pressed, his hands clean, his hair neatly parted. When he spoke, his voice was calm and soft, like a preacher giving comfort to a lost soul. But when the sun went down, that gentle face became something else, something dark, cold and unholy. He had a way of moving that made people uneasy. He never rushed, never panicked, never raised his voice. He walked through life as if death itself was walking beside him. And maybe it was. Jim Miller had developed a habit, a method, one that would become his trademark. He never faced his enemies in a fair fight. He never gave warning or offered a chance to draw. Instead, he waited. He planned. He studied his targets like a hunter tracks prey. Then from the shadows he'd strike, a sudden blast from his double-barrel shotgun, a flash of fire and silence. The next morning, someone would be dead, and Jim Miller would be seen in church, sitting quietly with his Bible open, bowing his head in prayer. It was this balance, holiness and horror, that made him so feared. People didn't know whether to shake his hand or run from him. Some said he did it for money. Some said he did it for revenge. But those who looked closer saw something even more terrifying. Jim Miller enjoyed the control. He enjoyed knowing that he could decide who lived and who died, and that no one could stop him. His white frock coat became his symbol. He wore it everywhere, clean, spotless, like a mockery of innocence. When witnesses spoke of seeing him before a killing, they always remembered that coat. It glowed pale under the moonlight, a ghostly color that made the sight even more chilling. He looked like an angel, one man said, but he carried the devil's gun. By this time, Miller's reputation had spread beyond Texas. Ranchers, bankers, and lawmen knew his name. Some respected him, others feared him, but all knew one thing. You didn't cross Deacon Jim. People would travel miles to hire him. A grudge could be settled with a letter and a bag of money. A rival, a sheriff, even a political enemy. It didn't matter who you wanted gone. If the price was right, Miller would ride. He charged between $150 to $2,000 per job, depending on the risk. To him, each killing was just another transaction, another service in his twisted version of justice. And yet he still prayed. He still quoted scripture. He still called himself a man of God. He once told a friend, "The Lord says vengeance is his, but sometimes he needs a little help." The friend laughed, but Miller didn't. He meant it. Every word. No one could explain how he got away with it for so long. Whenever a killing happened, Miller always had an alibi. He'd be seen miles away, sometimes in public, shaking hands and smiling. People swore they'd been with him when the murder occurred. The law could never make anything stick. It was said that he had friends everywhere, judges, sheriffs, even Texas Rangers who owed him favors. Money talked, and fear did the rest. Even when people suspected him, they stayed silent. Speaking against Jim Miller was dangerous. Many who didn't live long enough to repeat it. By the late 1890s, Miller was no longer just a man. He was a myth. Mothers told their children to behave, or Deacon Jim would come for them. Saloon doors went quiet when his name was mentioned. In church, even the preacher's voice shook when Miller entered. But there was one man who wasn't afraid, a ranch hand named Joe Earp, a cousin of the famous Wyatt Earp. Joe had seen Miller's work and called him out in public, calling him a coward who killed from the shadows. Miller didn't react. He didn't shout or draw his gun. He just smiled and said softly, "You'll regret that, Joe." A few weeks later, Joe Earp was dead, ambushed, shot twice with a shotgun. No one saw who did it. But everyone knew. Still, Miller walked free. He was untouchable. Every time someone tried to bring him down, the case vanished, or the witness disappeared. He seemed protected by something, maybe by God, maybe by something much darker. And so he kept on killing. Somewhere deep inside him, Miller believed he was cleansing the land, wiping out the wicked, punishing the disobedient. But the truth was simpler. He liked it. The power, the control, the fear in a man's eyes before the final shot. He was no longer pretending to be holy. He was using holiness as a shield. Each killing made him colder. Each prayer, emptier. The man who had once smiled in church was now just a shell, a walking sermon wrapped around a shotgun. The townsfolk had a saying now. When the man in white rides through your town, someone's gonna die. And deep down, even Miller knew that one day, that saying would come true for him too. Because no matter how far you ride, no matter how many prayers you say, the road of blood always circles back. The name Jim Miller had become a whisper of dread across the Southwest. He was no longer just a man. He was a warning. The people called him Deacon Jim in daylight and Killer Miller when the lamps went out. Wherever he rode, someone ended up dead, and yet no court ever dared touch him. He had built himself a wall of respect, money, and fear. He attended every Sunday sermon, wore his white coat pressed and clean, and greeted his neighbors with a kind smile. People nodded back, pretending they didn't know what he really was. They prayed not to end up on his bad side, or worse, his list. But even the deadliest man in Texas couldn't keep his world from cracking. Behind that calm face, the list of his enemies was growing. There were people who wanted justice, others who wanted revenge. The townsfolk had begun to whisper louder now. They didn't see a holy man anymore. They saw a killer who hid behind the cross. Jim Miller had grown too confident. He thought he could never fall. He took more contracts, more blood, more lies. He'd sit at home reading the Bible with his wife Sally, pretending to be a good husband, a good man. But when night came, he'd saddle his horse, load his shotgun, and disappear into the darkness. The next morning, someone would be found dead, a hole in his chest the size of a fist. People knew it was him, but they were too scared to speak. Each killing made Miller feel invincible. He thought he could balance both lives forever, the preacher and the assassin. But fate had started to move against him. One of his old rivals, a lawman named Bud Fraser, had friends too, men who hadn't forgotten what Miller had done. They talked in secret, gathering stories, collecting proof. Even though the courts had failed, the people hadn't given up. The time for whispers was ending. Still, Miller didn't see it. He was living comfortably now, buying land, raising cattle, and gaining influence. He was even respected among certain church circles. His reputation as a righteous man still intact in public. He had fooled everyone for so long that he had begun to believe his own lie. But the killings were catching up with him. In 1906, a rancher in Oklahoma was found dead under suspicious circumstances. The investigation led to rumors, and every rumor pointed to the same man, Jim Miller. This time, the law started to look closer. But Miller knew how to handle that. He bribed a few officers, threatened a few others, and the case disappeared. He smiled, thinking it was over. But it wasn't. Every time he walked free, he became a little more careless, a little more proud. He'd tell his friends, "The Lord protects me." But deep down, even he knew, it wasn't the Lord protecting him. It was fear, corruption, and luck. And luck never lasts forever. By 1909, Miller was living in Oklahoma, working as a ranch hand while secretly taking killing contracts on the side. He had done this for years now. Kill, pray, repeat. But that spring, he made the one mistake that would destroy everything. He accepted a job to kill U.S. Marshal A.A. Gus Bobbitt, a respected man known for his honesty and courage. The man who hired Miller promised him $1,700, a small fortune. To Miller, it sounded like another easy job. He'd done it 100 times before. He followed Bobbitt's movements for days, waiting for the perfect time. Then one morning, he hid behind a fence post near Bobbitt's ranch. As the marshal rode by, Miller fired both barrels of his shotgun. The blast threw Bobbitt from his horse. The man was mortally wounded but not dead. Crawling in the dirt, bleeding, he looked up and saw Miller's face. That was Miller's first real mistake. He let the man see him. Bobbitt survived long enough to speak his killer's name. Jim Miller was arrested soon after. The law had him this time. There was no escape, no alibi, no friendly judge to save him. He was taken to the small town of Ada, Oklahoma, and locked in a cell. The people were done waiting for justice. They didn't want a trial. They wanted blood. His blood. At first, Miller didn't seem worried. He sat quietly in his cell, reading his Bible, calm as ever. He told the guards, "God will deliver me like he always has." But something was different now. There were no politicians to protect him, no lawmen to bribe. Outside the jail, the streets of Ada were filling with angry men carrying ropes. The preacher who killed for money was about to meet his judgment. Inside the cell, Miller knelt and prayed, maybe for forgiveness, maybe for a way out, or maybe just out of habit. The same empty ritual he'd used to clean the blood off his soul for years. The guards heard the crowd shouting his name, hundreds of voices growing louder. "Bring him out," they yelled. "Bring out Killer Miller." And for the first time in years, Jim Miller felt fear. The man who had murdered so many with no remorse, who had smiled through every sin, now saw the end he had given to so many others. As the crowd stormed the jail, Miller stood, straightened his white coat, and took a deep breath. The storm he had created was finally here, and this time, he wouldn't walk away. The night was thick with anger in Ada, Oklahoma. The townspeople had waited too long for justice. Too many good men had died. Too many killers had walked free. And now, the one man who had escaped the law for years, Jim "Killer" Miller, was finally behind bars. The jailhouse was small, lit by a single flickering lamp. Outside, a crowd was gathering. Their voices grew louder, echoing through the dusty streets. "Bring him out," they shouted. "Bring out Killer Miller." Inside, Miller sat on his cot reading his Bible. His white frock coat hung neatly on the chair beside him. His hands were calm, his eyes cold. The same calm that had carried him through every murder now rested on him again. But this time it was different. This time he wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. He could hear the mob outside. Men's boots stomping, ropes creaking, guns being cocked. It was the sound of a town tired of waiting for the law to work. Miller closed his Bible, stood up, and smoothed his coat. He whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for courage. Then he put on his white hat, adjusted it perfectly, and smiled. When the cell door opened, the mob poured in like a storm. The sheriff tried to stop them, but it was no use. The people were wild with fury. They wanted blood, not mercy. They wanted the man who had taken so many lives to finally meet the end he'd given to others. They dragged Miller from his cell, his boots scraping against the floor. Dust rose around them as they pulled him into the cold night. The moon hung above them, pale and silent, as if even the heavens were watching. Miller didn't fight. He didn't beg. He didn't scream. He walked with his head held high, his coat still clean, his Bible still in his hand. They took him to an old barn on the edge of town, the same barn where other killers had been hanged before. The rope was already waiting. The crowd surrounded him, their faces twisted with anger and relief. For once they were in control. For once justice wasn't hiding behind a courtroom door. One man stepped forward and asked, "Do you have any last words, Jim?" Miller looked around at the faces. Men who'd lost brothers, fathers, friends, men who had lived in fear of him. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Let her rip," he said. Those were his last words. He didn't flinch. He didn't resist. He placed the noose around his own neck and stepped off the box himself. The crowd went silent. The man who had once ruled with fear was gone in an instant. His body swung gently in the dark, his white coat glowing under the moonlight. Some said it looked like an angel's robe. Others said it was the mark of the devil. The crowd stood still for a long moment. No one cheered. No one spoke. For years, Miller had lived above the law. Now he hung beneath it. When it was done, they left him there until morning. The sun rose slow and red, painting the sky like a warning. Birds perched on the fence, and the town of Ada began to wake. Some people came to see the sight for themselves. They whispered prayers. Others spat on the ground. A few made the sign of the cross. By noon, his body was cut down and buried in an unmarked grave. No one claimed him. No preacher spoke over him. No hymn was sung. The man who once quoted scripture before pulling the trigger now had no words left. No faith and no followers, but even in death, his legend didn't die. Stories spread fast, from Texas to New Mexico, from saloons to church pews. They said Jim Miller was seen riding again, his white coat shining under the moon. Some swore they saw his ghost standing at the edge of town, Bible in one hand, shotgun in the other. Others believed his soul could never rest, trapped between heaven and hell. Just like the life he lived, over time, his name faded into history. But in every Western town, his story lingered. The man who prayed like a saint and killed like the devil. People still argue about him today. Was he a murderer or a madman? A hypocrite or a holy avenger? Maybe he was all of them, but one truth remains. The same hands that turned pages of the Bible also pulled the trigger that ended countless lives, and in the end, the only man Jim Miller couldn't escape was himself. Morning came slowly over Ada, Oklahoma. The night before had ended in violence, and now the town felt hollow. People walked the streets with tired eyes, pretending life had gone back to normal, but every step echoed with what they had done. Jim Miller was gone, yet somehow his presence still lingered. The white coat, the calm smile, the quiet voice, all of it hung in the air like smoke after a fire. No one spoke much about the hanging at first. Some said justice had been served. Others said a sin had been answered with another sin. The preacher in Ada refused to mention it in his sermon. He simply told his congregation that the wages of sin is death, and left the rest to silence. But that silence didn't last long. Within days, stories began to spread. Some men bragged about being there, claiming they helped pull the rope. Others swore they'd seen Miller's eyes open after the hanging, still calm, still alive. One man said he heard him whisper a prayer even as the life left his body. No one knew the truth. The only truth was that fear still lived in Ada. Fear of the man they had already killed. They buried him quickly, outside town, in an unmarked grave. No headstone, no cross, just dirt and silence. But even that couldn't keep him down in people's minds. Miller had always been two things at once, holy and wicked, gentle and cruel, and even in death he remained both. Soon, travelers passing through Ada would ask, "Where did they hang that preacher who killed all those men?" And someone would point toward the edge of town and say, "Right over there in the old barn." You can still feel him watching. At night, that barn became a ghost story. Children dared each other to go near it. They said if you looked inside after midnight, you'd see a man in white swinging in the dark, his hat still on, his Bible clutched in his hand. Some claimed they heard footsteps behind them and a whisper, "Let her rip." For years, the legend of Killer Miller grew larger than the man himself. Newspapers called him the Deacon of Death. Dime novels turned him into a villainous hero, a saint who killed sinners, a man who punished evil while wearing heaven's smile. But the truth was far less romantic. Behind the legend was a broken soul who had spent his life pretending to serve God while serving his own hunger for power. Every prayer had been a mask, every good deed a shadow hiding a crime. Still, people were drawn to his story, maybe because it felt familiar. The idea that someone could look pure on the outside and carry darkness within. It reminded folks that evil doesn't always come with a black hat and a snarl. Sometimes it wears white and quotes the Bible. In the years that followed, the world changed. The Wild West faded into history. The railroads came, the towns grew, and the gunfighters disappeared. But Jim Miller stayed alive in memory, in songs, in bar stories, and in the whispers of old men who claimed to have known him. Some said his spirit cursed anyone who spoke his name in anger. Others said his ghost rode the plains, seeking the forgiveness he never found in life. And a few believed he had finally made peace, that somewhere, between heaven and hell, the deacon still prayed. Historians would later argue about him. Was he truly a monster, or just a product of violent times? Was he mad or merely cold? The records couldn't answer. The truth had been buried with him in that nameless grave, but there is one thing the people of Ada agreed on. After that night, something in their town changed. The fear that had ruled them began to fade. It was as if by ending Miller, they had ended a part of the darkness that haunted the frontier. Yet even as peace returned, some wondered if they had done the right thing. Lynch mobs had no law, no judge, no mercy. They had killed a killer, yes, but they had also crossed the same line he had. Justice had turned into vengeance, and vengeance always leaves scars. When the barn finally fell years later, no one built on that land. The locals said the ground wouldn't take to it. Horses refused to walk near it, and dogs barked at the empty air. The wind there always seemed colder, carrying a faint smell of smoke and gunpowder, and sometimes on quiet nights, travelers still claimed to see a man in a white coat standing by the road, hat tipped low, watching. Some said he was guarding the town. Others said he was waiting for the next soul to wander too close. Whatever the truth, Jim Miller's story became more than a tale of one man. It became a mirror, showing how good and evil can live in the same heart, how faith can twist into fanaticism, and how even the calmest smile can hide a storm. In the end, the legend of Killer Miller wasn't about the man who killed for money. It was about what happens when a person loses the difference between God's justice and his own. Because when that line disappears, the man in white becomes the devil in disguise. Years passed after the hanging in Ada, yet the name Jim Miller refused to die. His body was gone, his grave unmarked. But his story took root in the dust of the West. In saloons and train stations, in campfires and church pews, people whispered about the preacher who killed for God. It didn't take long for truth to bend into myth. Some said Miller was innocent, framed by jealous lawmen. Others swore he'd made a deal with the devil himself. The facts had blurred, and the legend had taken control. Writers came first, men who sold penny novels to a hungry nation. They painted Miller as a tragic hero, a man of faith forced to kill in a world of sin. They gave him fancy nicknames: the Deacon of Death, the White Ghost of Texas, the Preacher with the Shotgun. Readers loved it. The West was changing fast, and people missed the old danger. Miller's story filled that empty space, part horror, part history, all thrill. But in Ada, the people remembered differently. They didn't see a hero. They remembered a man who smiled as he pulled the trigger. They remembered the fear, the quiet funerals, and the way the streets had felt empty whenever he was in town. To them, Jim Miller was not a myth. He was a warning. Still, the legend grew. In the early 1900s, traveling shows began to dramatize his life. Actors dressed in white coats and wide hats reenacted the hanging. Crowds gasped when the actor said, "Let her rip," and stepped off the box. It became theater, entertainment, a ghost story people could clap for. No one in those crowds thought about the real men who'd died. They didn't feel the terror of being hunted by Miller in the dark. They only saw a symbol, the cold, perfect outlaw who feared nothing, not even death. Hollywood would later find him too. In the early Western films, there were always echoes of Miller. The polite gunman, the man in the white hat who turned out to be evil, the lawman who hid sin beneath scripture. He became a pattern, a shadow stitched into the stories America told itself about the frontier. Historians tried to untangle the truth. Some said Miller had killed more than 40 men. Others said fewer than 10. The records were thin, the witnesses long gone. What remained was rumor, and the echo of fear. One thing was certain: Miller had shown how evil could wear a smile, how faith could become a weapon. He proved that danger doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly, dressed in white, quoting the Bible. People began using his story as a lesson. Preachers warned their flocks about false prophets, men who spoke of God but lived by greed. Parents told their children to beware of those who looked too perfect. And storytellers, sitting by campfires, used Miller's tale to remind everyone that even angels can fall. As decades passed, the old barn where he died rotted away. Grass grew over the spot and the town changed. New buildings, new people, new lives. But on quiet nights when the wind blew through Ada, some said they could still hear a faint creak, like a rope swaying in the dark. Ghost hunters came later, with lanterns and recording machines. They claimed to capture voices whispering scripture or the sound of a shotgun being cocked. One visitor said he saw a white figure standing near the old barn site, head bowed, hands folded as if in prayer. When he blinked, it was gone. Whether you believe it or not, the story endures because it feels too human to forget. Jim Miller wasn't a monster from birth. He was a man who lost his way, a child who saw death too early, a lawman who thought he could control evil, a believer who let pride turn him into something unholy. That's why his name still comes up when people talk about the darker side of the American West. Not because of his killings, but because of what he represents, the moment when morality breaks, and a man convinces himself he's doing right even as he destroys everything around him. Every generation rediscovers him. A new book, a new film, a new documentary. Each time he's portrayed a little differently. sometimes as a villain, sometimes as a misunderstood soul. But behind every version lies the same cold truth. Jim Miller lived as if God owed him forgiveness. Maybe that's what makes his story timeless. Deep down, people recognize that struggle, the battle between what we show the world and what we hide inside. Miller just lost that battle completely. Today, his name is carved into the mythology of the West. You can find it beside the likes of Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and John Wesley Hardin. But unlike them, Miller didn't steal gold or rob trains. He stole peace. He robbed people of trust. And in doing so, he became the most chilling outlaw of them all. Because he didn't just kill men. He killed the idea that goodness could always be trusted. And that's why, more than a century later, the story of Killer Miller still rides through the dust. A quiet reminder that evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it looks like faith in a white coat. Decades passed, and the Wild West faded into memory. Horses gave way to cars, telegraphs turned into telephones, and the wide-open frontier became a patchwork of towns and highways. But still, somewhere out there in the dust of history, Jim Killer Miller refused to be forgotten. His story lived on, not in courtrooms or newspapers anymore, but in whispers, pages, and screens. People couldn't let go of the man who had worn white and killed in God's name. In the early 20th century, Western storytellers began searching for characters who blurred the line between good and evil. Miller was perfect for that. He wasn't just a gunfighter. He was something deeper, a contradiction in human form. A man who prayed for his victims, a lawman who murdered for money, a saint with blood on his hands. Writers saw power in that contrast. His life became a mirror of human weakness, proof that even faith could be twisted into darkness. Soon, his name appeared in magazines and radio plays. The stories changed with every telling. In some, he was a villain. In others, a tortured soul. Some storytellers said he killed only the wicked. Others said he enjoyed the killing itself. The truth had long been buried in that unmarked grave outside Ada. What survived was the myth. And myths never stay still. By the 1950s, when television began showing westerns to every home in America, the ghost of Jim Miller slipped into the script. You could see him in every polite outlaw, every smiling villain who quoted the Bible before drawing his gun. The audience might not have known his name, but they knew his shadow. In those stories, he became a symbol. The reminder that evil doesn't always snarl. Sometimes it smiles. Meanwhile, historians tried to pull him back from fiction. They dug through dusty archives, searching for evidence, letters, or photographs. They wanted to find the man beneath the myth. What they discovered was even more chilling. Records that proved his calmness wasn't an act. He was polite, organized, methodical, almost professional about killing. He kept his clothes spotless, his gun clean, and his conscience quiet. Some researchers called him one of America's first contract killers, a man who turned murder into business. Others described him as an early warning of what would come later, the kind of killers who hide behind charm, uniforms, or causes. And yet, there was still something fascinating about him. People didn't just fear him, they wanted to understand him. What made a man like Jim Miller? Was it his childhood trauma, the violent world he grew up in, or was it something darker that had always been there, waiting? Psychologists studying criminal behavior in the mid-1900s even used him as a case example. They said Miller was proof that morality can twist under pressure, that the mind can justify anything if it believes the cause is righteous. By the 1970s, documentaries began to appear. Black and white photos of Miller's stern face flashed on the screen, while narrators told his story in deep, haunted tones. His white coat, his shotgun, his last words, "Let her rip." The audience sat silent. Some were horrified. Some were amazed. All were captivated. The fascination only grew with time. In the 21st century, the internet gave Miller new life. Podcasts retold his crimes. YouTube channels analyzed his psychology. True crime shows called him the preacher of death. History buffs debated whether he deserved more fear or more pity. Even now, his story draws millions of views because it touches something deep inside the human heart. It's not just about guns or blood. It's about how easily a good man can become something unrecognizable. Modern storytellers often compare Miller to villains in movies. Calm, intelligent men who believe they're righteous. Characters like Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men or Gus Fring in Breaking Bad echo that same quiet evil, the face that smiles while death is near. Whether they realize it or not, they're all children of that same legend, the man in white who never blinked. Today, when historians visit Ada, they stand near where the barn once stood. There's no sign, no marker, no reminder of what happened there. Just wind and weeds, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the creak of rope, the murmur of a crowd, and the final calm voice saying, "Let her rip." It's been more than a century, yet the legend still rides. Some call him a monster, others a mystery, but everyone agrees Jim "Killer" Miller was something the world had never seen before and may never see again. He wasn't the fastest gun in the West, he wasn't the most famous, but he was the coldest, the man who taught the world that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and maybe that's why, even today, people can't stop telling his story. Because deep down, everyone wants to believe they can tell good from evil. But Jim Miller proved that sometimes they look exactly the same. The human mind is a strange thing. It can pray, it can dream, it can love, and sometimes it can kill. No one ever truly understood Jim "Killer" Miller. Even those who feared him most said he didn't act like other men. He didn't drink, he didn't curse, he didn't chase women. He went to church, read his Bible, and spoke softly. He smiled more than he frowned. To strangers, he looked like a man of peace, but inside something was broken, something that had been cracked long ago and never healed. People say a man becomes what the world teaches him to be. Miller's lessons began early. He saw death before he understood life, losing both his parents young, living through violence, and being blamed for his grandfather's death. All of it shaped him. Some say that moment, when he pulled the trigger as a boy, changed his soul forever. It taught him that death wasn't an ending. It was a solution. As he grew, he learned that calmness could be power. The quieter he was, the more people feared him. The kinder he looked, the less they suspected him. He discovered something few ever do, that evil doesn't need to shout. It just needs to wait. He lived his life by a strange code, his own version of righteousness. In his mind, killing wasn't murder. It was cleansing. It was the will of God carried out by his own hand. He prayed before every job as if asking permission. And after each kill, he'd thank God for giving him a steady aim. It wasn't insanity in the wild, shouting sense. It was calm, controlled delusion. A cold kind of madness that hid behind order and faith. Psychologists today might call it moral inversion. When a person convinces themselves that wrong is right because it serves their belief. Miller wasn't killing out of rage. He was killing with purpose. He saw himself as judge, jury, and executioner, guided not by the law of man, but by his own twisted version of divine law. Some say that's what made him so terrifying. Not his weapon, not his speed, but his certainty. There was no doubt in his heart. No hesitation. Every man he shot he believed deserved it. Every death was to him an act of justice. That's what made him unstoppable. You can argue with anger. You can reason with fear. But you can't reason with faith that has turned black. He once told a friend, "The Lord doesn't make mistakes, and neither do I." That one sentence explained everything. He had built a fortress around his conscience. No guilt could enter. No regret could stay. He carried the Bible not as comfort, but as armor, proof that he was on the side of righteousness. But even men like Miller feel the weight of their own lies eventually. Some said that in his later years, when he sat alone reading scripture, he'd pause, staring at the page as if the words had stopped making sense. Maybe he started to realize that every prayer was a brick in the wall between him and salvation. Others believed he never doubted. That even when the rope was around his neck, he still thought he'd been chosen by God to do what others couldn't. To him, death wasn't punishment. It was confirmation that he'd finished his work. Experts who studied his life say Miller showed all the traits of what we'd now call a psychopath. He was calm under pressure, charming when needed, and absolutely without empathy. But what made him different from others like him was the mask of morality. He didn't hide his crimes behind lies. He hid them behind religion. It gave him legitimacy. People trusted him because he looked holy. He used their faith against them, the way a magician uses distraction. While they saw the Bible, he pulled the trigger. And yet he wasn't just a villain. Deep down, he was also a reflection, a mirror of what happens when a man takes belief too far, when conviction drowns out compassion. Every great evil in history begins with the idea that it's doing good. Miller was a warning long before anyone had the words to describe it. His mind, his calmness, his faith. They all worked together to create something the world hadn't seen before. A man who killed not for chaos, but for order. He believed he was cleansing the world of sin, one shotgun blast at a time. But the truth was, with every kill, he was only cleansing himself, washing away his fear, his guilt, his weakness. Until, at the end, there was nothing left to wash. When the mob came for him in Ada, he didn't scream because he didn't see it as injustice. He saw it as destiny. His final act, to die calmly without fear, was proof to himself that he'd always been right. Even his last words, "Let her rip," carried that same strange peace, as if he were simply letting go of the last illusion he had: control. Modern psychologists might call him a sociopath. Preachers might call him damned. Historians might call him a legend, but maybe he was just a man who let faith lose its way, a man who mistook his voice for God's, a man who believed that killing could ever make the world pure. Time has a way of softening stories. Heroes become legends and villains become warnings. But some names never fade. They stay sharp, like a scar that never heals. Jim Killer Miller was one of those names. He wasn't the fastest gun. He wasn't the loudest outlaw. But he was something far more chilling. A man who smiled while death stood beside him. A man who prayed before he pulled the trigger. A man who believed he could balance sin and salvation with one steady aim. Now, more than a century later, his story still echoes through time. Not because of how he died, but because of why he lived the way he did. The boy who lost his parents grew into a man who lost his soul. Somewhere along the line, Jim Miller stopped being a person and became an idea. The idea that faith without compassion becomes cruelty, that law without mercy becomes tyranny, and that belief, when twisted, can turn even prayer into a weapon. People still debate who he really was. Some call him a monster. Others call him a victim of his time. But maybe he was both. Maybe he was the product of a world that rewarded power and punished weakness. A world that made killers into legends and legends into ghosts. When people tell his story now, they speak of the contradictions. The white coat that looked pure but hid blood. The quiet voice that preached peace but delivered death. The man who carried a Bible and a shotgun with equal devotion. Historians look at the facts. Storytellers look at the drama. But the truth lies somewhere in between. Because Miller's life was more than crime. It was a mirror, showing what happens when belief loses balance, when justice becomes obsession, and when the human heart mistakes control for faith. Every century has its own version of Miller. People who convince themselves they're right while doing harm. That's why his story still matters. It isn't just about one man in the Old West. It's about all of us. It's about the line we draw between right and wrong, and how easy it is to cross when pride takes the place of conscience. They say Miller's ghost still rides the plains of Oklahoma. Some claim to see him near Ada, standing by the road in his white coat, hat tipped low, as if waiting for judgment that never came. Others say they've seen his spirit kneeling, hands clasped in silent prayer, his face hidden in shadow. Maybe he's still praying for forgiveness. Maybe he's still convinced he never needed it. No one knows. But one thing is certain, the legend of Killer Miller became more than the man himself. It became a warning carved into the bones of American history, that evil doesn't always snarl. Sometimes it whispers verses, that righteousness when blind can turn darker than sin, and that justice without compassion becomes just another form of revenge. If you strip away the legend, what remains is a single haunting truth. Jim Miller was proof that even the calmest voice can hide a storm. And even a prayer can lead to blood. He lived believing that God was on his side. But maybe in the end, he was just a man talking to his own echo, mistaking silence for approval. When the mob's rope tightened around his neck that April night, the world finally stopped to listen. His last words, "Let her rip," still hang in the air more than 100 years later. Some say they were words of courage. Others say they were words of defiance. But maybe they were something else. A final acceptance that he had run out of prayers to hide behind. The rope did what no bullet ever could. It ended the life, but not the legend, because legends, even dark ones, never die. They travel, whisper, and wait. They become campfire tales, movie scripts, and ghost stories told to remind the living what they must never become. And so, as the dust of the Old West settled, one lesson remained: faith can heal, or it can destroy. Law can protect, or it can oppress. And every man carries two voices inside him, one that prays for light, and one that hungers for power. Jim Killer Miller listened to the wrong one, and that's why his story will always be told, not just as history, but as warning. Because the scariest monsters are never the ones who know they're evil. They're the ones who believe they're right.